Welcome back to our COMET-Farm training, where I'm demonstrating how to create a new project using the hypothetical Chico State Carbon Farm Plan for reference. We are now in the Animal Ag section of the training. If you have not completed the cropland section, please go back and do that first before proceeding here. The first thing you'll be asked in the Animal Ag module is to select the location for your operation. In this case, of course, we're reporting from Chico State, California, so we'll select California for our state, and we're looking at Butte County here. This is just relevant for weather data when calculating your emissions from manure and housing. Next, we'll be asked to select our animal categories. These are housed within overarching categories, so we have cattle, poultry, swine, other ruminants. So I'm going to go ahead and expand cattle and select grazing stockers and dairy dry cows. Now, next to dairy dry cows, you might notice that there are these little boxes that indicate groups. The groups are specific to dairy cattle, and they indicate herds of cattle that are managed differently. So if I have one group of dairy dry cows that are housed in a barn year-round and have their manure managed one way, and then I have another group of dairy dry cows that are out on pasture all year round, those are going to be considered two separate groups of dairy dry cows. In this case, for simplicity, I am going to just stick with one group. And then lastly, expanding to our other animal categories, I am also going to include sheep in order to replicate our hypothetical Chico State Carbon Farm Plan. Once I press save, that'll just take a minute to load, and then this step 3 will appear, and this is where we can begin entering management for each of these animal types. So we're going to go ahead and start with our grazing stockers, which are on the simple side of management. The first expansion is for animal details, where it's going to be asking us for the monthly population of our grazing stockers, as well as the average live body weight in pounds by month. Again, referencing the Chico State Carbon Farm Plan, I'm going to have 80 grazing stockers from June to November, and their body weight is going to gradually increase, starting at 600 and then increase by about 50 pounds each month. So we'll go from 600 to 650 to 700, 750, and then finally end up at 850 in November. And I'll go ahead and hit save. Next, we'll go down to our feed characteristics. Here, it's asking just for the months that there is a population, it's asking for forage quality, forage content, and optionally if there's any feed additive type. In this case, again, following the Carbon Farm Plan, we are going to have low quality forage for each of the months that there are grazing stockers. That forage content we're going to have at 80%, and because it is optional, we're not going to add a feed additive type. I'm always going to make sure I'm hitting save, and then I can close out, and we'll see that gray check has turned to a green check, indicating that management is complete for our grazing stockers. Next, we'll move on to our sheep, again because they're a little bit more simplistic than the dairy dry cows, which we're going to end on. Referencing our Carbon Farm Plan, we're going to have a population of 80 sheep year-round, so I'm going to use that blue arrow to just copy 80 all the way across the months, and I'm going to have the average weight be at 220. Under feed characteristics, unlike the cattle, it's going to be even simpler. It's just asking the average daily dry matter intake, and I'm going to have that at 3.9 pounds. Again, I have information that I'm referencing here. Next, we're going to be looking at housing, and this chart is going to come up again with our dairy dry cows, but essentially what it's asking is where are your livestock spending their time? So across months, with the total being 100, where are my sheep spending time? And in this case, they are spending 100% of their time year-round on pasture range. If I try to make that value go above 100, it is going to give me an error message and not allow me to proceed. But in this case, I'm just sticking at 100% pasture year-round. When we move on to manure, you'll see that we have a marker here saying that because the cattle are on pasture, I have no more management entries that are required. However, we'll go over those manure options when we see our dairy dry cattle. Back on our homepage, we can see that sheep and grazing stockers are complete, so we're going to go into our dairy dry cows, which is definitely the heaviest amount of content that we'll see in the Animal Ag module today. Again, under animal details, it's going to ask us again for population and live body weight across months. Based on our carbon farm plan, it's pretty simplistic. We have our population remaining 85 year-round, as well as our live body weight remaining at 1500 year-round. And so I'm going to copy those over using those arrows and then hit save. Now the feed characteristics panel is going to look different here than our grazing stockers. It's slightly more complicated and a little bit more detailed. If you have information for dry matter intake, crude protein, fat, and ash, you're welcome to just enter those feed characteristics yourself. However, most users are going to need to use the feed calculator because that will calculate those feed characteristics based on the feed type that your cattle, in this case, are consuming. The way the feed calculator works is you first start by selecting a month or range of months. In this case, we'll select April through July, that your cattle are being fed a certain feed type. So in this case, for those range of months, let's say we're starting with Bermuda grass, and we'll say for feed intake, we're looking at pounds per head per day. We'll say 14 for Bermuda grass, and then it automatically gets added into this table at the bottom of the panel. There are different search options here. You can use the sorting pills on the left-hand side to sort by certain feed types, and then we also have a search feature that allows you to type in certain terms. So we can search for a term, find it, and then add the feed intake from there. Then, when you hit populate feed, it will pop you back out to the main panel, and you'll see that your feed characteristics for those month or range of months have been added to this interface for you. In our case, based on the data that I have provided, rather than use the feed calculator, I'm going to add in the raw feed characteristics. So I'm going to put in 17.3 for my DMI, 10.6 for crude protein, 2.08 for fat, and 6.34 for ash. I'm then going to use the blue arrows to copy those across months, because in this case our cattle are being fed the same thing all year round, which again might not be the most realistic, but it's what I've been provided. I'll hit save, and that will conclude our feed characteristics. You can ignore the feeds that are included there. And now we're looking at our housing panel again, but this is the more complicated version that I was mentioning earlier. So the process is the same, where you're essentially accounting for the percent of time spent for your dairy dry cows in different locations. However, aside from dry lot and pasture range, we also have different housing added here. The selections that you make in this housing component are going to inform the questions that you're asked throughout the rest of the module. So for example, if I selected that my cattle spend 100% of their time in a covered barn, that's scraped vacuumed. Once you make that selection and you scroll down, you'll see that there are some follow-up questions based on that selection. In our case, we are going to have our cattle be spending 100% of their time in dry lot. So I'm going to make that selection, and then we'll move on to our manure. The first question under manure is always going to be, is an anaerobic digester used as the primary manure treatment method? And while our baseline management is going to be saying yes, I do want to just go over kind of the flow of the process if you say no. If you say no, you're going to go ahead and expand your housing, in this case dry lot, and you're going to be asked a series of questions pertaining to a solid liquid separator. And just as I mentioned that whatever housing you select will inform the questions you're asked later, the same can be said for your manure. So the selection you make based on the solid liquid separator is going to inform the remaining questions that you're asked. In my case, I'm going to go back out over to our anaerobic digester. I'm going to say yes. It's going to ask me the type of anaerobic digester, and I'm going to select a UASB. And then it's going to ask me about the digest date, and I'm going to say no. I could, of course, go into a lot more detail on every single question that's included in this Animal Ag module. However, it really is kind of a choose your own adventure. So rather than go through questions that are not going to be relevant to you, I think it's best to just kind of maybe open a demo project, click around, see what the different variations could be. Now, I mentioned that we are currently working on our baseline management. That term baseline means the same thing as it did in cropland, where it's your current management prior to making a management change. So you'll see at the bottom that you do have the option to just continue on to agroforestry, but we're going to opt to add a scenario. Similar to cropland, when you choose to add a scenario, you'll also be given the opportunity to copy your baseline to this new scenario. So you can either continue without copying your baseline, or you can copy your baseline. In our case, we are switching from a baseline that has our dairy dry cows on a dry lot using an anaerobic digester. And in this scenario, all we're changing is that those dairy dry cows are going to be moved out to pasture. So again, like I mentioned with cropland, if you're only changing one or two small aspects of your management, I highly recommend copying from your baseline. So that's what we're going to do today. Just like with cropland, it'll ask you for a new scenario name. Again, it's just our dry cows being moved out to pasture. So that's what I'm going to label it, dairy dry to pasture, and I'll save that. The scenario interface is going to look exactly the same as the baseline. This gray box in the upper right hand corner allows you to know whether you're working on your baseline or your scenario. All I'm going to do is go into my dairy dry cattle management, and under housing, where they once were spending 100% of their time on a dry lot, I'm going to switch that to be 0% of their time, and I'm going to switch pasture range to be 100% of the time. Now when I hit save, you'll notice that when I go down to the manure section, again, I will not have to answer any follow-up questions about pasture, just because it's quite simple. And that pretty much concludes our management for animal ag. So now we can continue on to agroforestry.